I think we need to start by saying to Roy Hattersley, who is here going to speak later, Roy, we join you in your grief for Buster. You have read of the terrible death of the sad death of Buster, and my agent happens to be Roy's memsahb, Maggie Pearlstein, so I used to occasionally, I have been to Roy's London house occasionally, and I knew what it was like to be greeted by Buster. And it was a bit like that bit in Keeping Up Appearances when Hyacinth turns up at her sister's house. You know, there's this TV program called Keeping Up Appearances, and Hyacinth the Bucket would turn up at her sister's house, and this ferocious dog would jump out of the car, and Hyacinth would leap into the hedge every time. I'm going to return to Hyacinth later on, but meanwhile, R.I.P. Buster. He was a great author. He was the only dog to have his own VAT number, I think, and we will all miss him. Anyway, my desperate little book, it starts off with a rant. Well, the whole thing's a rant. But it starts off with a rant against Jonathan Ross. You say that, but now look what's happened. The blasted BBC's gone and fired Ross. So you have to insert the word "not" into my first, regularly into my first chapter. But they fired him. I'm sure it's all a conspiracy theory to undermine my book. But Ross is gone. There he's sailing over the Thames, having been ejected by the catapult. And not before time, but it is a pity that he's been sacked, because you'll know that Charles Moore was threatening to refuse to pay his TV licence if Jonathan Dross remained in office. And as a result of this, it now seems that Charles Moore is not going to go to prison. And I think we must regret this, ladies and gentlemen. This is a pity, because it would have been a magnificent sight, would it not, Charles Moore in prison? He would have had a very sort of ascetic cell somehow. He would have enjoyed the dry bread. He would have taken well to the water. And there would have been shades of Sir Thomas More, his namesake. And I was thinking it would have made a good film, would it not? Charles Moore in prison. We could have had, who could have played him? There would have been that man, do you remember that man who played Jesus? What was his name? Robert Powell. Or I thought maybe Frank Thornton, who played Captain Peacock in Are You Being Served? Because there was about Charles Moore something of the Captain Peacock. He was the Captain Peacock of editors, so we missed that chance. Anyway, my book opens with this terrific blast, as I like to think it, at Jonathan Ross. And how did that geezer get his job? He couldn't speak properly. He looked a mess. He wasn't exactly a fearless interviewer. He was a dreadful sycophant. He had this babyish sense of humour, and he was hardly a creative maestro, Ross, was he? There was nothing particularly innovative about him. So how come he was hoovering up 16 million quid every 3 years of our money? And all for a TV programme, he was getting an audience, a correspondent in the Daily Mail Letters column, fine place, pointed out this week that Ross's TV programme got roughly the same audience as Songs of Praise. 16 million quid every 3 years. I mean, Alec Jones and Magnus Magnuson's daughter don't get that for presenting that programme. And so my thesis, I have a thesis, this book, and my thesis is that Ross is a great example of my thesis, is that mediocrity seems to be the must-have item in British public life these days. He was assiduously mediocre, this man, as a TV presenter. He could have been so much better, but there's more moolah in Moronic, is there not? And Ross, he's actually quite a clever bloke, but his TV show was just such a disappointment. And yet the BBC, which should aspire to raising us up, to celebrating excellence by showing the people of Britain a sunlit upland, instead they were forcing this terrible man Ross on us. They were settling for bog standardism, to use Alistair Campbell's phrase. And the only people who could escape Ross, really, were people who could afford satellite televisions. And this is another point I want to stress on you today. Is that you'll be looking at me thinking, there's a Daily Mail hack. This book must be a terrible right-wing foaming rant. Well, it's not actually quite that simple, I would put to you, because my point is that the neglect of excellence is actually doing much more damage to the people at the bottom of society than to the people at the top. The people at the top can get away with things. They can escape to the Canaries, They can educate their children privately. They can buy satellite telly. But it's the people at the bottom, you know, who get worst affected by the sort of things that have been going on. Now, I said I was going to come back to Hyacinth Bucket, and I will. I think she's terrific. She's a pin-up of mine. I don't mean those broad haunches. I mean the principles that lie behind Hyacinth. We are invited, are we not, to take the mickey out of Hyacinth. We are invited by the television people to laugh at her. But actually, what does she do? Hyacinth is standing up for self-improvement. She goes to church. She wears a hat. She's polite. She's actually jolly nice to her sister and Onslow, the sister's husband, that burpy, beery sloth in a vest. And Hyacinth is everything good, you know. She doesn't quite understand about her son, who's some sort of ballet dancer or something. But Hyacinth is she's trying to make the best out of herself, and I think we should celebrate Hyacinth. And I think that, in a way, what I'm saying is I think I like social climbing. Well, what is wrong with social climbing if you're trying to make the best of yourself? And the very word snob, take the word snob. I looked it up in a dictionary. I did some research for this book. And it started off, did you know that the word snob originally meant, it was a cobbler's apprentice. And this word has changed. It then was applied to the townies in Cambridge. They were called snobs. And somehow it became a terrible pejorative term to be a snob. And actually, if you think about the principles behind snobbery, perhaps I'm sounding a bit like a Thatcherite here, but it's to do with making the most of your earthly talents and God-given talents and pushing yourself forward. And I think that's a terrific thing, and I wish that we had more of it in Britain rather than this terrible state-imposed equality that we are all being told that we have to have these days. And the argument, again, I'm going to come back to this, is that the people at the bottom are the ones who can be made much more happy by having a gradation in society that people can climb. And I can't see why we're so against it. Then another word for social climbing, perhaps, is manners. And manners seem to have gone by the wayside, greatly to be mourned, particularly in language. And who are the people who are the most enthusiastic proponents of the F word? It's the Guardian. The Guardian newspaper, Polly Toynbee, there she is, she's a sort of crusader for the F word, and she and her ilk anyway. And do you know that in that Gordon Ramsay cookery programme the other day, they used the F word 232 times in 2 hours? I mean, that's more than the word and. That is really going some. And then there's this terrible squirt called Simon Shapps, who was an ex-director of television at ITV. And he called the use of the F word, this is in an article in The Independent, he called it a small victory for free speech against forces of darkness and repression. I just don't see how that works out. I would call the use of the F word more like a victory for grunt, futtocking loonies in the TV executive suite. And those are the people who are really benefiting from the F word because they sell more ads, maybe. But the people whose lives are made a misery by this, the people who live in the poor people who live in the sink estates of Britain, for whom the F word and other bad language is really quite intimidating, and it keeps them down. And my goodness, language is such a terrific liberator of talent. And if, as a poor child, you can learn a broad vocabulary and learn to use the English language. Look at Boris Johnson, look where he's come from. I mean, language is a terrific route out of the ghetto. And yet somehow the liberal left, the Guardianistas, think we all have to use the F word. I mean, there's only the editor of the Daily Mail who's allowed to use that as a word. Anyway. Another man I worship, along with another person I worship from television, along with dear old Hyacinth, is Simon Cowell. Now, I know this is dangerous territory for oldies, because Cowell, you may think that he's a bad thing. But I would argue that what Cowell has done, he's reintroduced into our society the idea that it's okay to have a bash and to fail.